partially, or for the most part, agree that capitalism is good for growth. Now the question is growth what we should value? And if we do value growth, how much weight, how much should we value that compared to other things like environment, animal well-being, human well-being, or does growth involve all those things? Let's talk about this, what the value of growth is and should be in today's world, or in the world we want to build.
Okay. One quick wisecrack before we go on. I would say that the house I'm living in was definitely built with private capital, I think. But I'm just bantering. Just in terms of the environment, there's a lot of interesting research on this, and I think this idea that capitalism exploits the environment, I think, is fundamentally not really accurate. I mean, think about in the UK. For many decades, the coal mines were operated by the government. In lots of places in the world, there are coal mines operated by government. There are coal power stations here in WA. Almost all of them are owned by the government here in WA. The ones in Queensland are owned by the government. So the thing is,
can I talk to that point straight away? So this is kind of where I was getting at, that it needs to be a wider argument. Like, both capitalism and socialism, as understood, are just ways of running an industrial economy. And the argument is, what's the better way to run an industrial economy? Should there be more private or more public? To me, the industrial economy is the problem. So whether a coal mine's owned by the government or whether it's owned by private capital, it's a coal mine. It's pulling resource out of the ground that's unreplaceable or irreplaceable, and it's putting pollution out into the atmosphere, which may never be sequestered. And so whether that coal mine is run by a workers' collective or whether it's run by, heartless, bloodthirsty capitalists, its fundamental functioning is the same, which is why, like, the argument to me over what's the better way to run an industrial economy should be secondary to, we need to stop running an industrial economy and begin exploring a different way to organize economic life on the planet. Because the industrial economy, whether it's private or public, is going to choke us all to death at some point.
Okay, let's go through a few things here. Firstly, I mean, there's lots of big companies that are targeting net zero carbon emissions, right? So when we say the industrial economy is going to choke us all to death, I'm very optimistic about the ability that society has to deal with climate change. I really am. I mean, there's examples of companies investing in carbon sequestration, technology is improving. There's people getting. Yeah, but the thing is, right? If we're, as you rightly point out, if we want to make sure we hit net zero by 2050. And not overshoot it. I think you sort of implied this. We're going to need negative emissions possibly at some point. We're going to need to try and take carbon out of the air. So sequestration is quite useful for that. So technology is developing apace. And it's interesting here in Australia and in America, it's like the governments are the ones that can't seem to get, when it's collective action, the governments seem to be the ones that can't get their house in order. Does Trump want to be in Paris or not? What's Australia's stance? And that's just when voters are, sorry, I'll go for a bit. That's just when voters are voting on how to spend someone else's money. If you go up to the workers' collective running a coal power station and say, sorry guys, you've got to shut it down. I think, and you can compensate them, but you can compensate them in capitalism too, right? But it doesn't get to the crux of the problem. The problem of transitioning to sort of carbon neutrality or to lower emissions or whatever else economy, whether they're owned by a workers' collective or whatever owns the means of production, whether it be private people or the government, the problem is still the same, right? It's that we have assets like a coal-fired power station or a gas processing plant or whatever else. And if you shut those assets off, all of the value of those assets, all of the labor to build them, all of the equipment in them becomes nothing. Society loses that value. It just loses it. It doesn't go anywhere. It just disappears. And there's an important trade-off, right? There's absolutely a trade-off in that we need to cut emissions and we need to look after the climate, but it's not a free trade-off. It's what we're talking about when we talk about shutting down industries is we are talking about severely lowering people's living standards. Just kind of turning off all the coal-fired power stations in Australia, for example, of course we could do it, but the amount of wind and solar power and batteries we would need to replace them with, all of this would require workers that would have to come from other industries. You know, in my state, there's an example of a green lobby group that has a great plan for 240,000 jobs in the low emissions economy, which is fantastic. But it's a sixth of the state's workforce. And to get those workers installing those solar panels or doing whatever else, you have to take them from other parts of society. So these things always involve trade-offs. It's not as simple as just as people saying, oh, gee, we need to cut carbon emissions. And I'm not accusing you of saying that, right? But it's very complicated to make the transition in a way where we don't severely damage people's living standards. But I think within 10 or 20 years' time, as coal-fired power stations get old, right, we'll replace them. And you know, we'll start to reforest and things like that. And there's much to be optimistic about, I think. You go for it. I'm also looking forward, just one thing, I'm looking forward to some slam poetry from you at some point, Yoram, because I understand you're a very experienced.
I can give one.
Yoram, before you go, I just have a quick question for Matt, because I think it'll give us some clarity. What incentive today do businesses have to become carbon neutral? Because you said many of them have become carbon neutral. Is there some economic incentive, or are they just doing it from the goodness of their heart?
Sure. I should say lots of them are promising to be carbon neutral. Well, some are, but lots of them are, the big oil and gas companies are promising to be carbon neutral in 30 years. I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one is there's an increasing number of people in society that don't want to buy power or whatever else from an organization that's polluting the planet, and fair enough. And again, that's human beings making their own decisions, making their own choices off their own beliefs. It doesn't require any sort of central coordination. And maybe you and I would both agree that that's a good thing. The other point is technology is improving in a really impressive way. So we're getting to a point now where you can have, I really love energy economics, so sorry to drone off, but we're getting to the point now where if you live in a remote community, it's cheaper for us to build solar panels and a battery and have it managed like that rather than a massive power cable going out into the town. And that's happening a bit in the developed world, and over time it's also, there's companies that want to take this technology into the developing world. So it's cheaper if you're in a village in India or wherever, think of a random country without power, it's cheaper to put solar panels there and a battery than it is to
100%.
have a coal power station and run a huge electricity cable all the way out there. So there's a bit of both social license and economic incentive.